Welcome to Christ Church Cathedral in New Orleans. We're happy to have you visit us. Over the next half hour, you will learn a little bit about our church, our history in the Diocese of Louisiana. We'll show you the beauty of God's dwelling place, and maybe, just maybe, will inspire you to learn more. Perhaps we'll spark an interest in the stained glass or the needlepoint, maybe the music or the history of this place. In any case, enjoy the tour.
It started with a meeting at 1009 Bourbon Street, in the original city now known as the French Quarter, right after the Louisiana Purchase. That acquisition, which doubled the size of the United States, comprised parts of 15 states and 2 Canadian provinces. It was felt by some to be threatening to the peace and prosperity of the country because of the likelihood that the priorities of the new citizens of the West would probably be different from people in the Northeast. There was also a question as to whether people in New Orleans should even be granted citizenship in the United States. And so it began. 53 people gathered to discuss starting a Protestant church, and most voted to have it be an Episcopal one. In November 1805, the first Protestant service in the Louisiana Territory was held at the Cabildo. You're not looking at the original Christ Church, which was built in the early 1800s. This is the fourth church. All 3 prior buildings were on Canal Street, the edge of the original city. Some elements of the early churches are still in use today. Some here, some in other Episcopal churches, and some in Touro Synagogue just up St. Charles Avenue. We'll talk about some of those elements later. This fourth Christ Church was designed in the Gothic style, like many Christian cathedrals in the United States and Europe. Notice that the arches and the windows are pointed at their top. There's a tower to the right of the main doors. The tower used to have a steeple on top of it, but a hurricane in 1915 blew it down. It was never replaced. The covered area just in front of the doors is called a narthex. In some churches, the narthex is just inside the entry door. Go through the main doors into the cathedral. The history of the 1800s and the history of Christ Church are intertwined. While there are many reasons to be proud of the founding of our church, there are also realities that we must not ignore. We must acknowledge the past, admitting that injustices were done. We continue as a faith community, striving to grow into the people that God intends for us to be. You'll see the connections at various places throughout this tour, and I'll point out several of them. The doors you entered are called the west doors, even though they actually face south. In traditional Christian churches, the altar faces the east. When the church location makes this orientation impossible, we call it the liturgical east. So the entrance facing the altar is the liturgical west. Take a look around. You're standing in the center aisle in the section called the nave. There are 2 more aisles, one on either side of the pews. This too is typical Gothic architecture. The side aisles are separated from the pews by piers or columns, the main support of the nave. Notice the stone baptismal font. This font was donated by a parishioner when the 3rd church was built and is one of the oldest objects in the parish. Now, walk up the center aisle to the row of pews nearest the altar. You are now standing at the crossing. That's the intersection of the nave, the wide center aisle and pews from the door you came in to here, and the transept, the rectangular arms to your right and left. Standing here, you see the building is in the shape of a cross. The section of the church from the transept forward, past the altar to the front wall, is called the chancel. It has 2 parts, the choir and the apse. Looking toward the altar, you see steps leading up through another set of pews parallel to the main aisle. This is the choir, and it is where the choir and other liturgical ministers sit during services that include singing. Beyond those pews, there is a rail and then the altar. The area beyond the rail is called the apse, and in true Gothic style, it has a rounded back wall. Face the door you entered and look up near the roof, all along the nave and the transept. Notice there are many stained glass windows up there. That area is called the clear story. The central portion of the roof above the pews is higher than the roof above the side aisles. This allows windows to be added so that more light can enter. Light is a symbol of God, so more is always better. Look around the church at the windows. Notice that you can see multiple shapes of windows. Most are pointed, shaped to fit in the arches. Some are called tympanum windows. These are small, round, or sometimes pointed windows, usually found just above doorways. You'll see both round and pointed ones here. Another type of window often used in Gothic churches is the rose window. It's large and round, usually installed above the main entrance or above the altar. You can't see rose windows in the cathedral, but there is one close by. We'll talk about it more when we go into the chapel. Now, look towards the altar again. As previously mentioned, Christian churches are traditionally oriented so that you are facing east when you face the altar. Turn to the right, looking into what is called the south transept. Remember, that's the arm of the cross toward the double door leading outside. Take a look at the pulpit. As was done in many churches before the advent of electricity, the large shell helped the priest's voice project better, so the sermon could be heard at the back of the church. Of course, this is no longer needed since microphones serve that purpose. The shell is kept for historical reasons and to focus the attention of the congregation on the priest as the sermon is preached. An angel, or perhaps Sophia, the figure of wisdom, holds up the lectern. Walk past the pulpit, keeping it on your left. You'll see a few steps coming down from your left. Go up those steps. Bishops are often buried in the cathedral of their diocese. Look down and you'll see the crypt of Bishop Leonidas Polk and his wife. Polk was a major contributor to the growth of the church in America. As the first bishop in the Louisiana Territory and missionary bishop to the Republic of Texas, Polk oversaw a vast area and was instrumental in the founding of several parishes in Louisiana. But at the same time, he was a slave owner. Before moving to Louisiana, he lived in Maury County, Tennessee, and was the largest slaveholder in the county, with estimates of up to 400 enslaved people in 1850. When he became Bishop of Louisiana, he made his home Layton Plantation in Thibodaux, Louisiana, for easy travel across the wide diocese. He enslaved people there as well. Craftsmen from his plantation built a chair you'll see later. Early after moving to Louisiana, he was rector of Trinity Church, New Orleans, on Jackson Avenue off St. Charles Avenue. He resigned as rector to devote his time to the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, which he helped to found. Then, Louisiana seceded from the Union in 1861. Polk resigned as bishop and took command of Confederate forces in western Tennessee. He had been a longtime friend of Confederate President Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. They had been cadets at West Point Military Academy at the same time. Davis appointed Polk a major general. His record as a field commander was poor. Historian Stephen Woodworth writes, Polk's incompetence and willful disobedience had consistently hamstrung Confederate operations west of the Appalachians, while his special relationship with the president made the bishop general untouchable. He was killed by federal artillery in 1864 and buried in Augusta, Georgia. His remains were moved here in 1945 and reinterred under the choir floor. Look to the left to see the organ console. It was built in 1847, originally for the third church, and moved here when the fourth church was built. Much of the original pipework was retained when the M.P. Moeller Company enlarged it in 1922, but many of the wooden pipes had deteriorated. In the 1970s and 80s, many enhancements and expansions were done. In 1991, Goulding and Wood totally renovated the organ. The organ has 4 manuals, or keyboards, plus pedals. There are 94 ranks. A rank is a group of pipes that all have the same sound. They can be combined in different ways using stops. All the knobs you see to the right and left of the manuals are used by the organist to change the sound of the organ. Trumpet, flute, bell, and string sounds, and many more may be heard from the organ. Think of the organ as the first synthesizer. The sound doesn't come from here, though. We'll see where it comes from in a few minutes. Since its founding, music has been important at Christ Church. In 1838, Bishop Kemper, missionary bishop of the Northwest, visited New Orleans. Of the music at Christ Church, he said, "The music was admirable, superior, I think, to any I ever heard before in a church." Music remains important at Christ Church. The choir, a group of both professionals and volunteers, sings at Sunday and special services for most of the year, and the organ is used weekly. At the end of this aisle, on the right, is the sacristy, where clergy don vestments for services, and the altar guild stores and maintains many of the beautiful articles of liturgical worship. Okay, now go back down the stairs and across the crossing to the other side of the church. Pass the main aisle and stop at the steps going up to your right. Just ahead to the right, you see organ pipes taking up the entire corner. When we talked about the organ a few minutes ago, we talked about how the organist changes the sound using stops. Stops change which pipes get air. You only see a small portion of the pipes here. Christ Church's organ is a large instrument containing 5,241 pipes. And if you glance down the main aisle towards the west door, you can see a few more pipes back there, just below the large stained glass window. Those are trumpets, used to give special emphasis in some hymns and other pieces. Walk up the steps and look down at a second crypt for Bishop and Mrs. Iverson Noland. Noland was bishop of the diocese from 1969 until his untimely death in a plane crash in 1975. Let's move up to the altar. Go towards the doorway in front of the crypt. Turn right and go along the altar rail to its center, facing the altar. Notice 2 chairs on either side of the altar. The larger chair on your left is the cathedra, or bishop's throne. It remains empty except during bishop's visitations. It serves as a visible reminder that the bishop is the spiritual head of the diocese. This building is called a cathedral because of that chair. The cathedra has an ornate staff at one side. This is the crozier carried by the bishop when giving a blessing or absolution. It is made from Louisiana magnolia wood. Now, look above the altar at the 4 painted figures. These are the 4 archangels, Michael, Raphael, Uriel, and Gabriel. At the front of the altar are 4 more winged figures. They show the authors of the Gospels as traditionally pictured: Matthew, a man; Mark, a lion; Luke, an ox; and John, an eagle. An altar stone in the center of the altar contains the oldest object in the church. In 1936, then Bishop Morris gave the cathedral a fragment of stone from Glastonbury Abbey, England. It dates from the 2nd century AD. It is set in a square of pink marble from a building occupying the site of the 3rd Christ Church. It was embedded in the altar in 1938. Look down at the kneelers along the communion rail. The procession from left to right shows the history of Christ Church from its founding through the bicentennial celebration in 2005. The needlepoint work was done by the women of Christ Church in the decade preceding the bicentennial. Most of the kneelers include elements of the cathedral's history, the Mississippi River, and an illustration of animals and plants native to Louisiana. The kneelers at either end and at the center show the procession of the church's history rather than the history itself. Start at the second kneeler from the left. The story begins with the start of the church in Louisiana in 1805, represented by the sunrise since there was no church building. The congregation first met in the Cabildo in the French Quarter. The boat shows the journey of the first rector, Philander Chase, and an early building where the church met. Move to the next kneeler. Christ's Church was completed at the corner of Canal and Bourbon Streets, where the Astor Crown Plaza now stands. The building was designed by Henry Latrobe, son of Benjamin Latrobe, the architect of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The first church was 8-sided with a cupola on the roof. No drawings or sketches exist. Problems started immediately. The walls were too weak to support the building. The church was torn down, and construction of a second church began in 1835. The kneeler shows an illustration of what the first church may have looked like: an urn with the ashes of Governor Claiborne, who granted permission to build the church, some parishioners, and a man on horseback. Look right to the next kneeler. The second church was designed like a classical Greek temple by Gallier and Dakin. You may have seen Gallier Hall, the old city hall on St. Charles Avenue. The church resembled Gallier Hall. 6 columns created an imposing front for the church. The building was consecrated in 1837. The kneeler refers to the rector, Dr. Wheaton, and shows Bishop Polk. There is a woman giving food to an orphan, French Quarter buildings, a riverboat, and a couple taking communion. Go past the kneeler that continues the procession at the center. To its right, the kneeler shows the next part of the story. By 1845, the design of the second church was questioned by the new rector, Francis Lister Hawkes. After debate about location, remain downtown or move further upriver, a new Gothic-style church would rise at a new downtown location, Canal and Dauphine, where the Ritz-Carlton Hotel is today. The old site would be used by the Jewish congregation due to a land trade between Christ Church and a local wealthy entrepreneur, Judah Turo. Later, Turo Synagogue would be built using columns from the second church and wood from the altarpiece to build the ark to hold the Torah. The new church was consecrated by Bishop Leonidas Polk in 1849. The kneeler also shows the church bell and flames depicting the destruction from the Civil War. Moving to the next kneeler. After the Civil War, Canal Street became more commercial. Finally, in 1884, the third church was sold. Many items were kept for use in a new fourth church: the bell, memorial windows, the chancel, and other items. A Gothic-style plan was chosen, and the cornerstone was laid in June 1886. The building was completed the next year, and the first service in the current church was held on Easter Sunday, 1887. The kneeler shows then Rector Drysdale, the cathedral, and the cathedral coat of arms. The second to last kneeler shows 2005, the bicentennial, with a streetcar, a house, around the corner from the church, the former Advent House, which was a center for prayer and spiritual direction, a chalice, the Mississippi River Bridge or Crescent City connection, and a compass rose representing the Anglican Communion. The final kneeler completes the procession through today. Now let's talk about the stained glass. Go back down the center aisle and down the stairs. Walk to the third or fourth pew. Turn back around and look at the 7 windows behind the altar. These windows probably date from the time the building was consecrated. Look up to your right above the organ and the choir, high on the wall at the clerestory level. The 4 figures are the archangels again, this time in glass. Now, turn around and look at the large windows above the west doors where you first entered the cathedral. The large window shows the Nativity of our Lord. To your left, above the door in the south transept, is a large resurrection window. Up at the clerestory level, still in the south transept, 12 smaller windows illustrate saints of the church. To your right, in the north transept, the large 3-paned window is the oldest window in the cathedral. It was brought from the third Christ Church on Canal Street. The 3 panels depict St. Peter, Christ the Good Shepherd, and St. John. The 6 windows at the clerestory level to the left of the Good Shepherd window represent important historical figures in this church. 2 windows of note commemorate Philander Chase, first rector of Christ Church, and Francis Lister Hawkes, rector when the third church was built. Now, walk about halfway down the main aisle in the nave towards the west door. The windows at ground level, to your left and right, show events from Christ's life. The windows up in the clerestory show St. Mary, St. Paul, and the apostles. Continue down the main aisle to the west door and look left. You can see a doorway. It leads to the bell tower. As we said at the beginning of the tour, the tower once had a steeple, but there is none now. Only the tower remains. The bell was made for the third church. It was wired to the local fire department so it could be rung to warn of fires in the area. It was also rung when the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, beginning the Civil War. The church's bell is used regularly to this day. It sounds on the hour throughout the day, at the beginning of each Sunday and weekday Mass, and at weddings and funerals. It also sounds the Angelus daily at noon, commemorating the visitation of the Archangel Gabriel to the Virgin Mary. Look at the window above the door. It commemorates St. Julian of Norwich. This is the church's newest window. It was a gift to the cathedral on the 100th anniversary of the building in 1986, given by the women of the diocese. Through those doors, there is an additional entrance to the church from the corner of St. Charles and 6th Street, which is not used today. That space is only used at weddings as a space for final preparations before the marriage ceremony. The tower also houses 2 memorial windows. Go through the doors and look right. 2 windows memorialize Lieutenant John Aiken, who died in World War II at the Battle of Guadalcanal. Next, we'll move to the chapel. Go back into the cathedral and walk towards the altar. Turn left when you pass all of the pews and go to the doors directly ahead. Don't go through yet, though. Look at the large wooden chair on the left of the door. This is a second cathedra. This chair is the clearest representation of the conflict between the good done in the past and the terrible injustices. This chair was first used by Bishop Polk after being crafted by enslaved people on his plantation. There was some internal discussion of whether the chair should even stay in the cathedral or be donated to a museum. Discussion with Bishop Michael Curry, the first African-American presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States, ensued. prior to a meeting of the Union of Black Episcopalians here in August 2016. It was decided that a special service of racial reconciliation would be led by Bishop Curry during that meeting. Bishop Curry sat in that cathedral as the leader of the Episcopal Church in the United States. When he, as a black man, sat in a chair crafted by enslaved people, he reclaimed it for those who made it. Skilled but enslaved artisans were forced to build it for Bishop Polk. Did they ever think that a black man would lead the U.S. Church and sit in the chair they made? Bishop Curry describes this event from his perspective in his book, Love is a Way. Quote, "It was a moment of heightened awareness for everybody, awareness of the horror of our history and of the hope that we don't have to be what we were. It was a moment of recommitment to the hard work of redemption and reconciliation, which starts with honesty about ourselves and our complicity with the past." Now, go through the doors. You're in the chapel. Work on the chapel started at the same time as work on the church in 1886. Lack of funds brought work to a halt. A church member, Elizabeth A.F. Harris, then paid to complete it as a memorial to her deceased husband, Joseph. The chapel building's style was designed to conform with the church's Gothic style, but the interior is much simpler. The inside finish is entirely made of southern woods. Behind the chapel was a Sunday school room, a library, and a guild room. Stained glass was installed above the west door and the altar. The window above the altar was done in the Belcher mosaic style. This was the first window in the South to be crafted using this technique. You can see the window above the door, but there is none visible above or behind the altar. In 1941, the vestry wanted a room large enough for congregational meetings. The chapel was remodeled and a soundproof wall was installed behind the altar to make room for other spaces. During these renovations, the rose window on the east wall was hidden. At the same time, the altar was raised onto a low platform and creation of a reredos began. What's a reredos? It's an altarpiece decorated with painting or sculpture at the back of an altar. Notice the gold leaf reredos above the chapel altar. It's a three-part piece illustrating many saints. The central panel shows Christ speaking on the road to Emmaus after his resurrection. The reredos was commissioned by a parishioner whose son, Robert Williams, died at a young age. The young man is included in the central panel. He is the man standing next to Jesus. Move up to the altar. Notice the two sculptures at the two panel hinges. Along with most of the other carvings in the chapel, these were created by local artist Enrique Alvarez. The one on the left depicts Bishop Polk standing on St. John's Church in Thibodaux, Louisiana, where his home, Layton Plantation, was located. The one on the right depicts St. George and the Dragon. In a commentary on events at the time, World War II, Alvarez used the dragon as a symbol of Nazi Germany. The dragon is slain by St. George. Alvarez carved swastikas into the dragon as a symbol of the defeat of Hitler and Nazism. Notice the golden African and Anglo faces of the angels just above the painting of Jesus at Emmaus. Also notice the evangelists above the two doorways and the Native American features of Matthew at the left side of the top of the doorway on the right, exiting the rear of the chapel. And if you look a little higher, there are even some faces in the trim at the top. One other interesting note, take a look at the pews. You'll notice an unusual metal mechanism at both ends of each pew section. It actually allows the seats to flip streetcar style, just as the seats on the St. Charles streetcar do. They can change direction. They were built to allow use of the room as a Sunday school classroom. Windows on either side of the altar illustrate the Ascension on the left and Pentecost on the right. The stained glass along the nave illustrates events from Christ's life. On the wall above the west doors of the chapel, the large window depicts Mary, Queen of Heaven, and the Christ child. Immediately over the door, notice that instead of a simple tympanum window, there's another depiction of the Christ child. Now, let's get back to the window behind the altar. Where is it? When modifications were made in 1941, another room was created on the second floor above the Sunday school and guild rooms. That space became the choir room. This work meant that the Belcher mosaic rose window that was an original focus of the chapel space was now hidden to all but the choir during rehearsals. The only ways to see it now are to look from the outside or to join the choir. Go through the door to the left of the altar in the chapel. Turn left and walk down the steps. Looking left, you can see the Cloister garden. In the 1950s, a new two-story building facing St. Charles Avenue was added to the property. An arcade connected the chapel porch to the front of the new building. This formed the Cloister garden you see here. Cloisters are typically found in monasteries. They comprise a quadrangle surrounded by covered passages. Cloisters are usually located on the south side of a church. This one is on the so-called north side. Remember that we ignore the compass directions and assume the altar faces east. A fountain in the Cloister garden depicts St. Fiacre, patron saint of gardeners. It was sculpted by New Orleans artist Angela Gregory. She was considered unusual because women's sculptures were virtually unheard of in her day. Thank you for spending time with us. We hope you have enjoyed this tour of Christ Church Cathedral. There is much more, but we can only hit the highlights. If you'd like more information about Christ Church, its programs, or its ministries, let us know. We'd be happy to talk with you and share any information we have. Please give us feedback on this tour. God bless.